Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk with Wajatli for the Left Hook Substack, where I invite a subject matter expert who's far smarter than me to break down some big questions. Today, I have for the first time ever Georgetown law professor Steve Vladeck. He's also the editor of the One First Substack that you all must subscribe to. And today, folks, it's excellent timing because the Supreme Court just decided to go ham, and there's a whole bunch of rulings. And before even I had we knew this was going to happen. I wanted to invite Steve to talk about all these other cases that are afoot. And every day there's some cases. Donald Trump is losing a lot of them at the district level. We'll get to that later, but whole bunch of news from the Supreme Court. So I'm just going to spin the wheel. I'm spinning the wheel. I'm spinning the wheel. I'm spinning the wheel. And it lands on reverse discrimination. Talk to us about this reverse discrimination case. What does it mean? A few people are very happy. A lot of people are unhappy. I give it to you, oh law professor and expert.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, I'm sort of medium, sort of like I'm whelmed, right? You can be overwhelmed, you can be underwhelmed. I'm whelmed. I mean, first, thanks for having me. It's great to be with you. I guess I'll just say the reverse discrimination case. This is a case called Ames versus Ohio Department of Youth Services, and it's one of the 6 decisions we got from the U.S. Supreme Court this morning. And the basic question was, Marlene Ames is a straight white woman who was suing the Ohio Department of Youth Services on the ground that she didn't receive a promotion that instead went to a lesbian woman. And she claims that that was discrimination based on sex in violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the lower courts had said that she couldn't bring her lawsuit because basically there's a higher burden, or at least there was a higher burden, to bring this kind of Title VII employment discrimination claim if you were a member of the majority racial or sexual or other group, right? Basically, that like the statute's not for you, it's for all the people who have historically been discriminated against. And what the Supreme Court held this morning in, a unanimous opinion by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, which may not be
Yeah.
who everyone would have expected to write this, is that the statute says what it says and doesn't have a different test for majority groups versus minority groups. Basically, that it's, sex-based discrimination can happen whether you are in the majority or the minority. Race-based discrimination can happen whether you're in the majority or the minority. And so, what we popularly call a reverse discrimination claim basically has the same standard of proof as what we might think of as a more conventional discrimination claim. Not that she's going to win, but that the relevant standard for her, for Marlene Ames, is the same as for anybody else.
And the when I see it, I'm like, isn't reverse? I mean, shouldn't there just be one discrimination, right? That the whole concept of reverse discrimination. The reason why it troubles me, Steve, is because maybe I'm so plugged into right-wing grievance and conspiracy theories, and I'm a masochist, and I believe you are as well. That I know for a long time, and going back even to affirmative action, right? It's this notion. Hell, going back to the 19th century, Civil War, going back to Birth of a Nation, right? The white man has been aggrieved. The white man is losing out. Anytime people of color and women and LGBTQ get their rights, it comes at a zero-sum game. It comes at our expense. The grievance, it's perpetual festivus, happening especially right now during Pride Month, where Pete Hegseth, speaking about a DUI hire who's failed up in life, his one agenda has been to purge the military of DEI, renaming all these ships, taking away Harvey Milk's name, Harriet Tubman's name, and replacing them with Confederate soldiers, right? So, I mean, am I being overblown here with my concern that this whole reverse discrimination case, and I know that the justices ruled on the law and the statute, right, 9-0 case, unanimous decision, will be used and abused by bad faith actors to essentially promote, let's be honest, white, straight Christians at the expense of everyone else and say CC, DEI, and everyone else. And every time the black gets it and the brown gets it and the gay gets it, it's coming at our expense. And we're being discriminated against.
So I certainly think that these threads are all sort of swimming in the same direction. I think the larger problem is that there was a doctrinal war that was fought over the question of whether our anti-discrimination law in the United States should be focused on what we might break into as what we call classification, or should it be focused on subordination? Right? That is our law going to start from the premise that what makes discrimination problematic is that it subordinates the people being discriminated against? Or is our law going to start from the premise that what makes discrimination problematic is just treating similarly situated people differently, period? Um, and that war was waged and it was lost by, progressives really 50 years ago. And, there are a series of US Supreme Court decisions from the 1970s that, frankly, I think are wrong, but that so much of our modern jurisprudence is now predicated on. Where, you know, 50 years ago, I think the Supreme Court would have looked at a case like the one it decided today very differently. From the perspective of, well, Title VII wasn't about this kind of discrimination claim, right? It's not a problem under Title VII. And what happens now, because that war has been lost, is it emboldens claims that trying to ameliorate historical patterns of discrimination against underprivileged groups is itself unlawful discrimination, right? That more than the politics of grievance, which is certainly a problem, I'm troubled more by how this actually undermines arguments for, preferences, arguments for sort of making sure that we're trying to ensure diversity in the workplace, right? For all kinds of ways of trying to level the playing field. Because it all sort of proceeds from the premise that the law has no responsibility to, remedy inequalities that are caused by social prejudice. And I
Right.
guess it just seems to me that that is letting the law off the hook for how much
Right.
of our modern social prejudice was caused or at least reinforced by law.
Law by judges.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's what concerns me, right? And especially when these justices, some of these justices are just telling you where they're thinking, right? Alito and Thomas in particular, about Obergefell, about contraceptives, right? About hell, Brown versus Board of Education. I'm just, it's the slippery slope or the Overton window shifting slowly, 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 slowly. Uh, Furthermore, to the right, saying, well, if we live in a diverse, equitable society, well, do we really need this anymore? And maybe we should just punt it to the states because there is no more discrimination, so we don't need the Voting Rights Act and
but
onward and onward.
but it tells you something, right? That this was a unanimous decision written by Ketanji Brown Jackson. I mean, like that's what's striking about this case is not the result to me; it's the lineup, and it's really, I think, a sign that for all the battles that Justices Sotomayor and Kagan and Jackson are fighting right now, trying to relitigate this one is just not something they're going to do. And that's I can understand that, but it really drives home at a powerful level how much this war has been over for some time from the
Wow.
perspective of trying to have a body of anti-discrimination law at the federal level that um, was more, I think, representative of the world we actually live in than the colorblind paradise that the judges who espouse this say we should aspire to.
But I think it is important that you mentioned that there, and I'm going to elaborate on this. That this whole concept. Well, the law is neutral. The law is the law, and the Constitution, the Constitution. I don't buy that, right? Because I am a recovering attorney. I went to law school, licensed, practiced for a while. But we've seen throughout history judges interpret the law the way that, that's how you got Plessy, right? That's how you got Dred Scott, right? That's how you got them saying, yeah, only those who are of the Aryan stock are white and can be citizens, and so forth and so forth. And especially with this Supreme Court, what we have seen, especially with the conservative majority, is the analysis has shown is that there is a preference towards always siding with, not always, but most of the time siding with white Christians and helping white Christians or Catholics, right? And there was another case today, the siding with Catholic social ministry over tax exemption. Can you talk to us about that case?
Sure. So this is another one where I think some of the battle has already been lost. But so this is a case called Catholic Charities Bureau versus the Wisconsin Labor and Industry Review Commission. Um, and basically, this is a sort of a bit of a weird case because even though a lot of states have statutes like this, Wisconsin had read theirs rather aggressively. So, Wisconsin law exempts certain religious organizations from paying unemployment compensation taxes, as many states do. Um, and the statute exempts those organizations that are operated primarily for religious purposes. And so the question is, like, what does that mean? Um, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court held that the petitioners in this case were not operated primarily for religious purposes because they neither engaged in proselytation nor limited their charitable service to Catholics. Um, I
Mm,
gotta say, like, I am troubled by a lot of the Supreme Court's religious liberty jurisprudence. This one struck me as a little, you know, hard to swallow on Wisconsin's part. Um, right? Like, looking at what the Catholic Charities Bureau does, right? The notion that they're not who the Wisconsin legislature meant. Um, um, so the Supreme Court, in another unanimous decision, says the way the Wisconsin Supreme Court interpreted its statute violates the First Amendment because the First Amendment mandates governmental neutrality when it comes to denominational preferences, when it comes to how the court is supposed to think about what a legislature is doing. And the majority here said the Wisconsin Supreme Court had imposed a denominational preference by differentiating between religions based on theological lines. Like, are you proselytizing or not? That's not something we want courts really doing. What I think is more significant about the ruling, and it was a unanimous decision written by Justice Sotomayor. So again, right, like,
yeah.
it's the left side of the court. What I think is really striking about the decision is um, only Justice Thomas wanted to go further. And so Justice
Mm,
Thomas, who has for years been trying to really expand the First Amendment's protection for what he calls church autonomy, basically the idea that, like, religious institutions should not get to be told by the government how to do anything. Um, and so Thomas really used this case to try to lay into that. And what's striking is no one joined him, right? Not even
not
Alito
even
or
Alito, huh?
Gorsuch,
All right.
right? And I guess, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't join him in a case where it actually mattered, right? But I do think that this is another example of the Democratic appointees finding common ground with the conservative appointees on a somewhat narrower ruling that's really not moving the line very much to avoid dividing over a
Mhm.
principle that might have had much broader ramifications.
Got it. I understand. I understand. And before I talk about another case, I don't know if we'll go over all six. We could, but there's a third case I really want to talk about. But I brought this up as well because when it comes to churches, when it comes to Christians, when it comes to Catholics, so this court, especially with the conservative majority, they've done the analysis. It overwhelmingly leans in the side of specifically uh, Christians and churches, right? But we saw an interesting split, and there was a news that came out 2 days ago that privately Trump is grumbling about Amy Barrett, that she's not a loyal soldier, right? Because one of the big cases that I was really worried about was, essentially taxpayer dollars being used for a religious private school, and was split decision 4-4, and Amy Barrett decided for whatever reason to step aside, and MAGA sees her as a traitor. Can you unpack that for a bit? What's happening there?
I mean, there's a lot going on there. So one of the things that we've seen, not just in the religion cases, but more generally, is that Justice Barrett has emerged as I wouldn't use the word independent, but as a somewhat less lockstep, predictable vote for a lot of the president's actions than he might have suspected. Indeed, than some of Justice Barrett's critics might have expected. That she is, um, in not a majority of cases, but in a meaningful subset of cases, breaking from the other Republican appointees and joining the Democratic appointees, either in dissent or maybe in the majority with Chief Justice John Roberts, um, in ways that I think have surprised a lot of people, including President Trump. President Trump doesn't see things in terms of legal principles. He just think he's so transactional that all that matters, right, is that, like, she's not voting for him. Um, I think it's something that's a little more subtle. I don't think it's that, like, she has somehow flipped. I think it's that she's always been a little more independent. I mean, she, came to the federal bench as a law professor. Um, Unlike, say, someone like Brett Kavanaugh, right, who had to come up in the Bush White House. And I think if that's your background, if that's your training, your principles might be very different from my principles, but they're still principles. Um, so I guess part of what's happening with Barrett is that in the Oklahoma school case specifically, we knew she was recused from the moment the court agreed to hear this case back in January.
Mm,
And part of why I, at least, was really worried when the court granted cert, notwithstanding her recusal, was
mhm.
because, the court can count to five better than we can. Um, and it seemed to me that they would not have taken up this case if they weren't confident that there were going to be five votes to, allow publicly funded religious charter schools in Oklahoma. The fact that the court ended up splitting 4-4, which has the result of the court calls it affirmed by an equally divided court. What it really means is it's like we never took the case in the first place. Um,
Amazing.
right? That to me is less about Justice Barrett, who we always knew was not going to participate, and more about the unidentified fourth Republican appointee who joined the three Democrats in voting to dump the case. Um, you know, I would bet pretty good money that it's John Roberts.
Yeah.
Um, and that
I
really
would
makes
bet all my money that it's not Alito and Thomas and Gorsuch. So,
well. So by process of elimination, we've ended up in the same place.
yeah, yeah.
Um, right. And so I think part of what's happening here is that we have the most conservative court we've seen, certainly in our lifetimes, if not in the court's history. But we also have a court that is not as committed to the president's agenda as, it's often caricatured as. And so there are going to be cases, maybe fewer than you or I would like, but there are going to be cases where at least some number of the, Republican appointees are going to be on the wrong side from Trump's perspective. And because to Trump, nothing matters other than loyalty.
That's
Um,
right.
all of those votes are treasonous, right? All of those votes are treachery. When I actually think it's really reflecting at least a modicum of principles and a modicum of institutionalism, right, on the part of those justices.
Yeah, I agree with you, Steve. Is that I'm under no delusion whatsoever that just because a Barrett or a Roberts or maybe even a Kavanaugh once in a while sides with, oh, I don't know, decency and common sense and principles, that somehow they're either moderate or they're like part of the rebellion against Trump and right wing authoritarianism. I think they are firmly established in part of the right wing, groomed by the Federalist camp, and they will be who they are. But I do think we're seeing, like you said, some principled action by Barrett and others, and also this type of like subtle defiance that we're the Supreme Court. There is something about checks and balances, and we're going to flex our ego and our power once in a while as well. And as you've seen, if you followed when it comes to the political side, folks, MAGA ain't happy at all with Barrett, right? They call her a DI hire. They're mocking her. It's misogynistic, And Trump in the past 2 days was for the past few weeks, but in the past 2 days has come out that he is privately grumbling. And he wants someone who's more of a sycophant. So a lot of you all are saying Eileen Cannon, yeah, or maybe Justice Janine Pirro. May God please strike down my prayer. I hope that does not reach the heavens, right? But we're in the situation right now where we have the Supreme Court and we have these six rulings. The third ruling I really wanted to talk about was the justices rejecting Mexico's suit against gun manufacturers. Unpack that for us and your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, this one's a little complicated. So, the government of Mexico had brought a lawsuit against a number of U.S. Gun manufacturers, claiming that the manufacturers aided and abetted. So basically, that they, were sort of consciously aware of how their firearms were making their way into the hands of the Mexican drug cartels and leading to massive amounts of violence and death and economic loss in Mexico. And, in ordinary legal systems, that would be a perfectly viable claim, right? That, hey, you business, you are causing this sort of long term nuisance to me. Um, the problem here is that back in 2005, Congress enacted a statute called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. Everyone calls it PLACA because we have to give everything an acronym.
Acronym. Yep.
And PLACA is this really extraordinary statute in that it basically cuts off a whole bunch of otherwise viable lawsuits if they're basically challenging whether a gun manufacturer or a gun seller um, it should be responsible for sort of the downstream effects of guns. So it's
Got it.
basically sort of trying to take what we would ordinarily call secondary liability and all but foreclose it for anyone involved in the lawful manufacture and sale of firearms. There are some exceptions to the statute. So there are some contexts where you're allowed to sue these folks anyway. And what the Supreme Court held today, again in a unanimous decision, this time by Justice
Right.
Kagan, was that this particular lawsuit didn't fall within one of those exceptions, and that the Mexico had not alleged enough to
Mhm.
tie the manufacturers to the drug cartels. And so PLACA, as opposed to ordinary principles of liability, barred the lawsuit.
Yeah, and that's probably why it explains, right? They just looked at it and they're like, it's not enough there, and that's why you got the 9-0. But it's also interesting if you just zoom out for a second, the fact that in the United States of America, where we have 400 million guns, Steve, more guns than people, you're seeing the downstream effect of gun violence on our neighbor Mexico, where Mexico is like, yo. Can you hold someone responsible for this? We're dying. And the Supreme Court's like, just not enough there. Sorry. But I mean, I'm just thinking from a policy perspective, this was a really interesting case for me because, especially as Mexico, and especially Mexico's leadership is reeling against America for the trade war, and also, because measles is spreading from Texas to Mexico, we've also now seen this a 9-0 decision. I'm very curious how that impacts Mexican U.S. relations moving forward in the Trump administration.
Well, I mean, that's a totally, I think, prescient point. I'll just add, there's also something awkward about treating Mexico like it's any other plaintiff. So there are a whole number of Supreme Court cases where justices from across the ideological spectrum have suggested that like foreign sovereigns have special privileges
Mm,
when it comes to litigating in U.S. courts. That courts should be especially deferential to foreign sovereigns because we don't want to, interfere with foreign relations. And yet here, the court is basically saying Mexico is no different from you or I when it comes to trying to bring a lawsuit like this. I also wonder if that's going to have downstream effects where we're going to see more cases where, foreign sovereigns don't get any kind of special treatment, at least when they're plaintiffs, even if the courts are going to continue to sort of bend over backwards when they're defendants.
let's see. There are three other cases, but I also want to talk to you about a whole bunch of other stuff. But I'm going to spin the wheel. Do you want to talk about any other cases, or should we move on?
No, I mean, I think the larger point that I think is probably worth stressing, because the other three cases are all pretty dreadful, right, is, what's one of the things that strikes so it might seem odd to folks who don't spend, as much time watching the Supreme Court as I do, which I think is just about everybody on the face of the earth, right? Might seem odd that we got 6 decisions in June, and all but one of them were unanimous, and the one that wasn't unanimous was 8-1. So I guess there are two things to say here. The first is it's actually not unusual that, like, in early June, we have a day like today where the court clears out a bunch of big cases that you and I find interesting and we're talking about, but the ones where they're not bitterly divided. So, like last term, for example, the mifepristone case where the court
Right.
ruled 9-0 that the plaintiffs didn't have standing, and that was an early June decision. So the first thing to say is this is actually kind of par for the course for early June. The second thing to say is the other thing going on, which was not going on last year, is even as the court is clearing out the 57, 58 cases it heard oral argument in this term, it is just totally underwater with an unprecedented number of what we call emergency applications.
Yep.
Right. And so these are the sort of requests not only from the Trump administration, but predominantly from the Trump administration, asking the justices to put rulings by lower courts on pause, on everything from birthright citizenship to Doge access to Social Security data, to the mass reductions in force or RIFs of federal employees, and it is just we've seen so the Trump administration has filed 17 of these applications in the first 18 and a half weeks of President Trump's second term. To put that number into context, um, during the Bush and Obama administration, so 2001 to 2017, 16 years, two very different two-term presidencies, the federal government filed a total in 16 years of 8 of those applications. We're now
Wow.
so we've gone from one every other year to once a week. And these are not small potato cases. These are massively important cases that are also dividing the justices, taking up their time, and with huge both political and legal impacts. And so part of why this is a unusual June for the Supreme Court is because the merits docket, the decisions we get at 10 a.m., one at a time, is really only a small part of the story of what the Supreme Court's doing right now.
Right, and I'm so glad you mentioned that for those who aren't lawyers or don't follow the Supreme Court or don't understand. Essentially, what the Trump administration has done is kind of uh, done its best under the guise of emergency appeals to sidestep the judicial process and as someone mentioned, these district judges and say, "Hey, Supreme Court, emergency, 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 rule on this. Can we deport all these brown folks without due process and send them to a gulag? Hey, 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 can we ban these foreign visas? Hey, 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 can we just disband USAID and Department of Education?" And then the Trump administration, like you mentioned, bring things back full circle. Well, this is my Supreme Court. Who cares about this district judge? I'm going to get the stamp of approval from the Supreme Court to do what I want. And then when the Supreme Court comes out, and rules unanimously and says, the Alien Enemies Act, it can't be enforced right now because we're not under invasion, we're just going to straight up ignore it or lie about it, which is what Stephen Miller did, right? Like literally lying about the ruling, which is remarkable. It seems it's a deliberate strategy, Steve, but isn't the strategy working?
Yes and no. I mean, I think part of the problem here is that there's so much going on that anyone from anywhere along the spectrum can selectively pick out stories and cases and say, "Look, this proves my thesis." Um, and the whole playing field is a little more complicated. So, yes, so far the Supreme Court in, gosh, 7 or 8 cases has granted some kind of emergency relief to the Trump administration. But there have been some really big cases where it didn't,
Right.
including in the Alien Enemies Act context. There have been some pretty big losses for Trump in this context, like in Abrego Garcia,
Yep.
where the government had argued that the federal courts had nothing to say about a guy who was wrongfully removed to El Salvador. And I think it's really. I wrote about this in my newsletter for Monday this week. I also think it's really important to talk about the dogs that are not barking. Um, there are hundreds of lawsuits against the Trump administration. According to my research, there have been at least 97 different cases in which federal judges have issued some kind of order blocking
Yep.
something the Trump administration is doing. So it's 97 orders. The Supreme Court has maybe frozen 7 or 8 of them. Right? Most of the lower court rulings are going into effect. And there's a lot of discussion out there about the administration not complying with these decisions. Again, it's because we're sort of seeing one tree in the forest. Yes, there are a couple of high-profile cases where the government is being coming this close to the line, if not crossing the line. But then there are other cases where they're complying. So the law firm executive order cases, where 3 different federal judges have blocked executive orders against law firms, and the government hasn't appealed. Just yesterday we saw the government bring back from Central America someone who was wrongfully removed in one of these
A
cases.
woman, right? A woman,
Right?
right?
So I just like I think we have to be a little careful to not skew all the way toward everything is awful or everything is great. Like, the courts are doing, I think, on the whole, a pretty darn good job. The Supreme Court, I think, is probably the most sympathetic to the Trump administration, and it is still not giving Trump everything he wants.
I wanted to talk to you about that. And it was a great lead-in about the fact that it's Trump. And we're gonna have some good news here, folks, before we get to some bad news again. But most of the cases, like Steve said, Trump is losing most of these cases, right? And it's these district courts and these judges who are slapping him down. You mentioned, especially when it comes to immigration without due process, they keep saying nope. They need due process, right? And there was a case yesterday which I was thank God for these district judges. Let's see if they appeal it to the Supreme Court. But it's really terrifying to see where the Trump administration wants to go. Is there's Mohammed Salaman is the suspect who allegedly, I mean, we saw the video. Burned 8 Jewish protesters, right? Who were protesting for the members of the hostages to come back, and so this administration had to try to deport his family, including his 5 kids. Right? Let's wait for it. Yeah, you're innocent until proven guilty. We've seen the video. I have no sympathy for this man, right? We still have due process. So this administration says, we're going to deport Mohammed Suleiman's family, including his 5 kids. And then yesterday, a judge comes and blocks the deportation of the Suleiman family. Can you just talk to us about that case and I think why it's so chilling and well, it's like what you said. It's the good and the bad. The good, intervention. Judge blocks it. The bad, the fact that they want to literally deport the family members, the kids of a man who's suspected a suspected terrorist.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that Trump is losing a lot of these cases, and in a lot of these cases is just complying with the losses, is not getting reported because it's not good television, right? It's not clickbait, right? Administration
Uh,
complies with court order, like no one cares, right? Um,
I care.
well, so do I. But so I don't mean to make light of the serious cases where they really are coming right up to the line and I think crossing the line, right? But like we should be celebrating how well the courts are holding up against what really is unprecedented pressure. Um, we had just earlier this week the Senate Judiciary Committee had its second hearing in as many months about all of these bad district judges with the temerity to rule against the Trump administration. And it's like, give me a break. Like, if you think what the administration is doing is lawful, pass some legislation to authorize it. um, so I guess maybe it's because I'm a Mets fan, and so I'm like a fatalistic optimist. But
You suffered. You're used to suffering.
I'm used to finding the good in the suffering,
Yeah.
right? And to me, like, yes, things are really, really messed up right now. But the story of the role of the federal courts, at least over the first, 4.5 months of the second Trump administration, is to me actually a very positive one. And I would include the Supreme Court in this, even though I think some of the Supreme Court's decisions really probably should have been even more aggressive in pushing back against Trump.
And another one, judge blocks Trump administration's efforts to eliminate Job Corps. Judge orders due process. Judge blocks, like I said, the deportation of Suleiman's family. Trump losing most of his cases. Trump can't fire. The one good news about the Supreme Court is they said, no, you can't just fire everyone. A couple weeks ago, well, excuse me, almost like just a week ago, they said Supreme Court can't fire. Supreme Court tells Trump he can't just unilaterally fire Powell. So there are some wins here, folks, right? But I think the key thing here is, and I share with you, you want a little bit more of a robust fight. And there's a piece of news that came out this week, which I think is good news, is that due to the pressure, right? I'm sure you've heard this a lot. I'm sure you hear this from so many people. Well, I'm not a professor. I'm not a judge. I'm a nobody. I'm an average American. What can I do, right? I mean, this is terrible, right? They're deporting folks. They're gutting USAID. They're gutting Veterans Affairs. It's retaliation. And you saw the pressure that was put on these law firms, right? These law firms that bent the knee, that obeyed in advance, that gave or have pledged $1 billion of pro bono legal work to Donald Trump. And you saw that Wall Street Journal article that came out this week, Steve, that said a lot of these corporations now are moving away from these law firms because people are like, oh, you're doing business with that law firm that bent the knee? Yeah, I'm not gonna support you. Your take on that? What's been happening with these law firms who bent the knee preemptively, and now as of this week are getting a backlash?
So I mean, I think I know I'm going to sound like a broken record. I think two things are true, right? I think the first thing is that the law firms who bent the knee should all be hanging their heads in shame. That it is almost unconscionable to me that you would look around and think that like you could make this deal. I'm reminded of the scene at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, where Lando Calrissian's complaining to Darth Vader about changing the terms of his deal with the Empire. And Darth Vader says, I've altered the agreement. Pray I don't alter it any further. It's like, we all understand how this works, right? Like, what are you doing? Um, the problem is, right? So again, there's good and there's bad. The problem is not that these lawsuits aren't going to win. They are going to win. They are winning. The problem is that Trump gets what he wants, even if some of these lawsuits succeed, because by not appealing them, like there's a reason why they're not appealing. Those don't become precedents that apply to other law firms. And so Trump can go and strong arm the next law firm, right? He can sort of bully the next law firm into submission. And so, like, yes, the firms that are standing and fighting are winning, but Trump and his people are also being savvy about when to cut their losses in ways that are not necessarily undoing the damage of the effort to basically single out these firms and punish them.
Yeah, to quote Born Identity, I see Empire Strikes Back quote, fantastic. I'll give you a Born Identity quote. Look at what they make you give,
Right.
and it's never enough. It's never enough. They want more and more and more, right? And so we're seeing, I wouldn't even say what these federal judges are doing is resistance. They're just doing their job,
They're doing their
right?
job.
And that's what's important. And when you listen to, I saw some clips, right? They're like, oh, it's all biased and activist judges. And I remember one of the people they were interviewing. She said, well, the Trump administration could just try following the law, and you know,
No, this it was a remarkable thing. So Josh Hawley, right, was pushing Kate Shaw, who's a common law
there you go.
professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the co-host of Strict Scrutiny, about how there have been so many more nationwide injunctions against the Trump administration. And Kate says, like, well, maybe they're doing more lawless behavior, right? Like, it's just
Great
logic is
quote.
not. I mean, the goal here is not to persuade people who are capable of, sort of reasoning for themselves. The goal is to spin a narrative that those who are inclined to believe everything they hear from these folks are going to find plausible. And, one of the things that I find striking about the data with regard to these district court cases is you hear folks who just live in the right wing ecosphere say, oh, it's just a handful of activist liberal judges, right? And then you say, well, actually, no. So far, it's been at least 73 different federal judges sitting in 25 different federal district courts
Yep.
in 10 different circuits, appointed by 7 different presidents, including presidents of both parties, such as President Trump. Like, you know, if you can use data to persuade people, here's a case where the data is all on one side.
No, it's deep state. I don't like your data, and because I don't like your data, it doesn't vibe with
Right?
my
Like, judges are
politics.
all part of the conspiracy.
Yeah, all part of the conspiracy, even the ones
But
that
by
he
the way,
appointed.
except the judges in Texas, where we keep sending these cases to.
Yeah, yeah. So Amy Barrett, even though he appointed her, she's part of the deep state, and Justice Ludwig, conservative staunch, former judge. Nope, he's part of the deep state, and even I'm forgetting the name of this judge, very respected conservative judge, that was appointed by Reagan in his 80s, who just gave the most blunt
Harvey
analysis,
Wilkinson.
talking about birthright citizenship,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Like, it is blatantly unconstitutional on the face of it, right?
Oh,
So,
sorry, that was Kugenauer, and then there's also
yeah.
there are so many different Reagan appointees to choose from, right? Then there's Harvey Wilkinson, who wrote an ode to due process and the role of the courts in one of the Alien Enemies Act in Abrego Garcia, right? So, it's all you have to do is look at the entire data set to see what are basically undeniable conclusions about how non-ideological the pushback against Trump has been. And the folks who insist otherwise are just, refusing to accept that that the moisture they're feeling coming down from the sky is not rain.
Yeah, don't look up.
Exactly.
The final question I want to ask you is because this is really concerning me. This was news that came out about 2 days ago in the New York Times, and because the zone is flooded with so much shit, people are already forgetting, massive crises that would have been essentially crises for months if it was Obama and his tan suit, or if it was Biden or hell, or even if it was George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. The Supreme Court is going to review this case about mail-in ballots. I don't know if you know about this. It's brought by Republican activists. And what really concerns me is that they're going to review this case and basically decide whether or not mail in ballots, even if you are postmarked, right? Even if you send it, say the deadline for the election is 1 week from now and you send it and they receive it 2 days later. Well, should we count those ballots or not? And then you see the attack on the USPS, the attack on mail-in ballots, the fact that our infrastructure is failing, the fact that mail is taking longer, the fact that some Republican activists would love to discount mail-in ballots, Steve. That even though if you did your job and sent it in a week before and they received it a day late, they would love to discount it. This case is really kind of terrifying me. Am I wrong to be terrified? Your thoughts on this case?
I, um, I I don't know if you're wrong to be terrified. I guess the problem is I can live with any number of rules for voting as long as the people know far enough in advance of the election what the rules are. Right? That like, tell me what the rules are in time for me to plan appropriately with regard to voting. Like we should make it easier to vote. Yes, but in the world we live in, right? If you say, okay, the mail has to be received by election day, then all the organizers will work like overnight to make sure everyone mails their ballots in 10 days early. Um, I'm much more concerned about the sort of the subtler efforts to try to sort of delegitimize our institutions, right? Like a case that's just about like when is the deadline, right? That is about just sort of what is the legal line, and then everyone adjusts their behavior accordingly, right? I think what's far more nefarious is the ongoing effort to have just sort of everyone lose faith in all of our institutions so
Yeah.
that we don't trust the vote counters, so that we don't trust the judges, that we don't trust the media, right? So that we don't trust anybody. And if we don't trust anybody, then, if you'll forgive a Hamilton reference, right? If you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for? Um, and it just, I'm much more worried heading into the midterm election cycle next year about the broader, if more difficult to quantify, ramifications of eroding confidence in institutions than any one particular rule about how people vote.
And to echo what Steve was saying, right now we have a 5 decade low trust in media, and we have a record low trust in the Supreme Court. And the way things are going, folks, it seems like we're going to have decreased faith in our institutions, especially if you look at the polling from Gen Z and Gen Alpha. They have really little faith in this country and declining hope and optimism in our country's future. That is not good for a democracy, right? And as such, I think we have to lift up some of these wins that we've talked about, right? These are wins. These are judges doing their jobs. Judges appointed by Republican presidents, judges appointed by Democratic presidents who are simply saying, no, that's unconstitutional. No, you can't end birthright citizenship. Nope, we have due process in the Fifth Amendment. Nope, you can't just deport terror suspects family, including his kids. And the fact that Steve said that Trump has lost most of these cases. And I wish losing these cases and this type of geekery over the law was as sexy as Sieg Heil's and a white genocide bullshit conspiracy theories that Donald Trump does. But sadly, it isn't. But nonetheless, 1.5 thousand of you have joined us for this breakdown of some of these Supreme Court rulings today and some of the judicial pushback to Trump. And I know Steve would have he delivered. He gave me a nuanced view, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and he nerded out and he gave some exquisite pop cultural references. He gave an Empire Strikes Back reference that I knew. So he's good people. Steve, final thoughts to you, final words to you.
No, just I mean, one of the things that I'm really heartened by, given everything that's going on in the world, is how engaged everybody is. And it's not just that we can get 1,500 people to turn out at like 2 p.m. on a random Thursday. It's that folks I think are asking, many for perhaps the first time, what else they can do. And I just want to say, like, everyone's circumstances are different, but talk to your friends, talk to your family members, talk to the Yankees fans in your life. Um, I think the more that we can build community about the things that ought to matter to all of us, about due process, right? About having sort of some trust that the courts actually are doing, their job fairly, even if we might not agree with how they're doing. Like, just you know, use your energy in whatever space you can to lift up the people around you, to educate the people around you. And if that means showing up for Substacks like this, great. If that means, other stuff, great. But it's just all of the above. Now is the time for civic engagement more than anything.
And you have to like Steve because he's a Mets fan, where he could be a New York Yankees fan, but he goes for the underdog. I always respect the. There you go. Look, he even has a hat, so he knows perpetual suffering. But in perpetual suffering, there's always hope. It's like a Cleveland Browns fan. And you built the Star Wars Lego. I was gonna get that. Well done, Steve. I know you're good people. And we have the Millennium Falcon, as we all know. The Millennium Falcon was given to Han Solo. Well, Han Solo won it. And who was the original owner? Steve, tell him.
Lando Calrissian.
Lando Calrissian. I thought I would talk to Steve for 30 minutes, but altered the deal and kept him for 45 minutes. Folks, this has been the Left Hook. I believe in what Steve said. I want to keep people informed, and as such, like a fool, I have no paywalls. I keep everything for free. Pay what you can. I'm like Blanche Dubois. I depend on the kindness of strangers, but mainly you have to be informed. An informed public is an aware public. An aware public then can be intentional in the way it acts, and keep up the pressure. Yes, yes, the Supreme Court exists. Yes, there's separation of powers. And guess what? The Supreme Court has 9 justices. They're human beings. They're influenced by public opinion. Trust me. If you don't believe me, look at U.S. history. So be loud. And you've seen in this week, again, look at that Wall Street Journal article that these corporations are turning away from the, I agree with Steve, the shameful law firms that bent the knee in advance. And because people are so disgusted by these law firms, they're moving away. And some of these companies that completely abandoned their DEI, like Walmart and Target, guess what? People bought into companies that went all in, like Costco, Tesla. A lot of average Joes, nobodies said, you know what? We don't want to support a dude who does double Zig Heils and promotes Nazi conspiracies. Tesla stock tanked. So be informed. It is your Supreme Court. It is your judges. These are public servants. Run for office and support good Substacks like Steve Substack. Steve, tell them where they can find you.
Sure. So my Substack is called One First, which is a really not clever play on the Supreme Court's physical address. And you can find it at stevevladek.com.
And the last thing I'll say, and this is just for Steve, because you'll appreciate this. Right now, I'm working on the 6,000 piece Mandalorian Razor Crest Lego set. It's taken me a month and a half, and I finally got one of my jewel sets, the UCS Imperial Shuttle, which I will seek to build in August, and you will then see that next to the Millennium Falcon, because you need the good with the evil, folks. That is a deep cut for those who know. Steve knows. Yes, Agent 99, a nerd. I am what I am. Folks, thank you all for watching. Support Steve, become a subscriber to One First. And until the next time, take care of yourselves, be informed, be kind, and please, no, please don't be a fascist. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.